So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the very last of our long hot summer series, Getting Ahead of the Heatwave. This is a special webinar series that has been a combined effort from IMAS, the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, and CMS, the Centre for Marine Socioecology. We've had a webinar every morning this week on different aspects of the marine heatwave that we're currently experiencing. Our first session was around the physical parameters of the heat wave. We've heard about effects on the ecosystem, on our fisheries, what help is happening in various sections of the community. And today we're talking about a topic that's very dear to my heart, which is around communicating climate change and communicating science in general. Before we get started, my name's Professor Gretta Pecl. I'm the Director of the Centre for Marine Socioecology and a Professor of Climate Change at IMAS. We'll start off with an acknowledgement of country. So no matter where we live and work in Australia, we're on unceded lands. And like we heard in yesterday's session, the Palawa of Litruwita are very strong and active custodians of the land, seas and waterways that we're living and working on, and we want to pay acknowledgement to them at the start of this webinar. We'd love to have your questions. You can feel free to pop them in the chat at any time as we're going through the webinar, but we will answer those all at the end in a panel discussion. So today we've got, we're starting off with Associate Professor Matt Palmer talking about the psychology of distrust in science. We then go to Dr. Chloe Lucas about communicating across polarised audiences, and then Dr. Gabi Mocatta about how we communicate to drive action and inspire hope. So the whole point of this webinar series was to help raise the awareness of the marine heatwave that's happening, the impacts that might occur and we're already seeing, but importantly to highlight the action that's happening and how we're all part of a networked community that's really trying to work together very strongly to maximise the information that we can learn about the heatwave and importantly what we can do down the track. So I'll kick off by handing over to Associate Professor Matt Palmer. And Matt, if you can just briefly introduce yourself at the start as well.
Morning, everyone. I'd just like to echo Gretta's acknowledgement of country. My name is Matt Palmer. I work in the School of Psychological Sciences here at UTAS. I do work on cognition and a little bit of social psychology. Most of my work is to do with understanding how people process information, understanding how people use evidence to make decisions, when that goes wrong, and what we might be able to do to help with that. And a big part of my work at the moment is on communicating scientific information, particularly about climate change, to the public. And today I'm going to be talking about the psychology of distrust in science. In some ways, this is a little bit of a funny topic. If you think about science and the kind of people who do science, I would have thought we're all fairly trustworthy and likable, and some of us, a little bit more like rock stars than others. And so from that point of view, it might be a little bit strange to think that we've got any problem at all with trust in science. But the fact is we do. There is an increasing trend in many places around the world for people to put less trust in science and less trust in scientists. It's useful to think that this change in trust, it manifests in two different ways. Okay, so you can think about it in terms of the two questions we've got in bold on the screen there. The first one is to do with, are scientists being a bit dodgy? Okay, so this goes to the integrity of scientists and their behaviour. One example of how this comes out is when people say that things like, well, scientists stand to benefit from exaggerating their results. So things like the effects of climate change. You occasionally come across opinions where people think that scientists will get more grant money if they exaggerate the benefits of climate change. So these kinds of issues go to the integrity of scientists. The other way you can think about trust in science and trust in scientists is whether we know what we're doing. Okay, and in terms of climate change, this plays out in ideas like when people make models and projections, are they accurate? Why are they not more specific? Why aren't the predictions more definite? Why are there inconsistencies in the data? Okay, so these kinds of things essentially go to the competence of science and scientists. So they're the two ways we can think about distrust in science. There's a whole range of factors that influence the extent to which people trust science and trust scientists. But if we think about the things that predict distrust in science, there's actually one factor that seems to be far and away the most important predictor, okay? And that is the values that people hold, okay? There's a few ways we can think about values. Maybe the simplest is to think about how people might lean politically. So the values we've got in yellow there on the screen are the things that are associated with more distrust in science, more distrust in scientists. So in terms of politics, if people sort of lean right rather than left, if the people are more politically conservative, then on average, you'd be more likely to distrust scientists and science a little bit more. Similarly, if people are into personal freedom as opposed to the collective good, if people like the idea of a free market and are opposed to regulations, and if people don't mind the idea of existing sort of status and hierarchies in society where some people are sort of ranked higher and better off than others, people don't mind that as opposed to equality, then they're more likely to distrust science and distrust scientists. Now, this is really important because as people's values play into the extent to which they distrust science, this affects the extent to which they accept information, policy advice, and so on that's based on good scientific evidence, okay? So people who hold essentially conservative values, more likely to distrust science, and in turn, more likely to reject things like information about climate change, policies to do with mitigating climate change, and so on. So this is a really, really important issue. Now, I just want to highlight two very, very important things about this pattern we've got on the screen here. Okay, so the pattern being people's values play into the extent that to which they distrust science, which in turn affects the extent to which they buy into information based on science. So two things about this pattern. One is it's getting stronger over time. Interestingly, if we go back a few decades, particularly in places that are really polarized, like say the USA, if you go back a few decades, it was actually almost flipped around. So a few decades ago, it was actually more likely that people who hold conservative values and vote conservatively were more likely to trust science and more likely to trust the things that scientists were saying about stuff like climate change. That's certainly not the case now. It goes in the other direction now, and the pattern is getting stronger. The other thing to note about this pattern, and this is really interesting, is that it gets stronger as people increase in terms of their education level, their scientific literacy, and so on. So the extent to which people's values affect their trust in science, and that affects the extent to which they buy into scientific advice, that pattern gets stronger as people get more educated, more science literate, and so on. This might seem a little bit strange because you'd think that as people get better educated, as they know more about science, they would have more faith in the scientific method, more faith in scientists, and maybe be more accepting of the advice and information that comes from science, but it's not the case. So the kind of thing we find in many countries around the world is what we've got on the screen here. Okay, so over on if you look at the horizontal axis there, here we've got scientific literacy. On the left, we've got people who are lower in scientific literacy. On the right, you've got people who are higher in scientific literacy. And if you look at the two sloped lines there, the dashed line represents people with relatively progressive values. The solid line is people with relatively conservative values. And you can see that the gap between them in terms of how much people accept evidence for climate change, the gap between them gets bigger as scientific literacy increases. And you get the same sort of pattern when you look at when education increases and so on. So why on earth do we get this kind of polarization of attitudes? Well, this is where psychology has some interesting things to say. Maybe the simplest way to understand this is in terms of what we call motivated reasoning. Okay, so there are lots and lots of situations in life where people have fairly strong motivation to hold particular views and hold particular opinions. Okay, in the case of things like climate change and accepting scientific information about climate change, there's a ton of motivations why people might be inclined to not accept that kind of information. They could be to do with your membership in a political group and wanting to endorse the values of that group. There could be a range of social and economic motives. So maybe you run a business that tends to profit from something like a fossil fuel emitting industry, those sorts of things. There's actually a whole range of reasons there why people might be motivated to reject the findings of climate change science and to not trust scientists. Just want to emphasize here, it's easy to sort of slip into the temptation of thinking that people who hold conservative values are being a bit dumb in this regard. And certainly there are cases where people don't seem to be thinking very well about this. But I want to emphasize the idea that this isn't all illogical. There's some really good examples of how it can be very adaptive and very reasonable, very logical to endorse the values of your community. And there's a whole range of social, economic, and so on benefits that come from doing that. So I just want to emphasize that it's useful to not think of this at all in terms of that conservatives are a little bit silly about this issue. Now, when we think about the psychological mechanisms that drive this kind of motivated reasoning, the most important thing to be aware of is the thing we call confirmation bias. Now, this is something that many of us will have come across before. Confirmation bias refers to the idea that we interact with the world, we process information in a way that confirms what we already think. Okay, some really smart researchers consider this to be the single biggest, most powerful bias in all of human thinking. I tend to agree with that point of view. In terms of how confirmation bias plays out, when we think about the information we might encounter in the world, we actively look for stuff that confirms our point of view. And when we come across information, we pay more attention to the stuff that confirms our point of view. If we think about climate change science and climate change scientists, there's a ton of material out there for someone who might be inclined to look for something that aligns with their values. If you're not inclined to buy into climate change, if you don't want to think that climate change is real and that we don't, and if you want to think we don't need to do anything about it, there's a ton of material out there. A lot of misinformation in the media, a lot of misinformation in social media, a lot of high-profile personalities, political leaders, and so on, who are providing that kind of information. And even in less obvious examples, when you get cases of, like, say, what we might call artificially balanced reporting. Okay, so we're all familiar with the idea that news reports might include both sides of a story. You know, some scientists think that climate change is a big problem, other scientists are not so concerned about it. Those kinds of things all provide material for people to process and attend to in a way that aligns with their views. And as well as that, whenever we come across anything that's not clear-cut, whenever we come across information that might be a little bit ambiguous, we're really good at interpreting that in a way that lines up with our views. Now, when we think about confirmation bias and how these processes occur, and why we get this polarization of views as education increases, as science literacy increases, the real crucial thing to understand is that as we get more educated, as we get more knowledge, we get better. We get better at twisting and reinterpreting and using information to line up with things we already think. Okay, and this is a really important reason why we get those polarization of attitudes, okay, bigger differences between people with different worldviews, bigger differences as education increases. So what can we do about this? Well, there's actually a ton of stuff we can do, but what I'm going to do is not go into these now because I don't want to step on the toes of my two wonderful co-presenters, Chloe and Gabi, today. So what I'd like to do is just sort of pause there and hand over to Chloe and Gabi, who are going to talk a lot more about what we can do about this situation in terms of communicating information to different people in a really positive way. And we can always come back to some of the points that I could talk about a little bit later on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. I genuinely find all of this incredibly fascinating. And I wish the climate change community had started thinking about a lot of these things many decades ago. I'll now hand over to Dr. Chloe Lucas. So Chloe, welcome. If you could share your screen and just start off by briefly introducing yourself.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Greta. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and Matt's talk really is an excellent way into my talk, which really takes on some of those learnings from psychology and looks at how we can use them. So I'm a human geographer, and I really draw on lots of different kinds of scholarship from sociology and psychology and human geography to think about why some people don't care about climate change and how we can communicate better with them. So this was the topic of my PhD research a few years ago. And over the course of that study, I got to know quite a few people who were not concerned about climate change. And what I learned from getting to know them really surprised me. I found that Most of them in one way or another were actually a lot like me, and we shared a lot of values. And as I got to know them, the things that we had in common helped us to start to have really meaningful conversations about some of the issues where we did disagree. So in having those conversations, I learned a lot about my assumptions and my approach to climate communication and activism. And so what I'm hoping to share today is not any kind of quick fixes or things that will solve the problem, because it's a long-term relationship building thing, I guess. But what I hope is that I can offer some ideas to anyone who in this long hot summer is finding themselves in kind of uncomfortable conversations with people who do think differently about climate change. So why do we think differently? Well, as Matt said, we all interact with the world through this kind of filter of our existing understandings and worldviews. But just as it's easy to forget, like me, that you're wearing UV filtered magnifying contact lenses, we have these kind of cultural, social, ideological and linguistic filters that are so transparent to us that we often don't even realize that they're there. We do tend to be better at noticing them in other people. So, you know, in that, what Matt was saying about noticing that people with conservative worldviews are biased, we may be seeing that more clearly than we're seeing some of our own biases. Our cultural lenses affect how we understand and interpret information. And research shows that providing information about climate change is not effective to change the minds of people who are unconvinced because of that confirmation bias. That we have the ability to misinterpret or dismiss information that doesn't fit with our views. So this is really useful to us, as Matt said, because it allows us to be in agreement with our tribe, but it also diminishes our ability to have meaningful discussions about divisive problems with people who think differently. So we give clues to what our cultural lenses are in the ways we define our identities. So I guess the fundamental markers of who we are, our identities, how we show who we are, is things like where we live, what we do, and who we do it with. But people also, and more, are using their views on controversial issues as ways to express that they belong to a particular social group. They use them as identity markers. So this means that often people's reactions to being asked about these issues actually are kind of off-the-shelf responses. They're not necessarily deeply held views. So an example of this is, while I was having a conversation doing a survey about climate change during my PhD, I asked somebody about his level of concern about climate change, and he said, well, I'm a bit of a greenie, so you better put very concerned. And it's that kind of thing that if it was as if his self-identification as a greenie determined his response rather than actually his understanding of climate change. But this creates a tricky situation. So when these kinds of problems become partisan, they're no longer just issues to be resolved, but the symbols of our own identity and that of the group, the tribe that we identify with. And when we communicate inside those tribes and we only hear our own views echoed back to us, the result is often that those views kind of get amplified, so they become more and more extreme. And this way, it means that groups with different views can become more and more polarized. And within group identity, diversity of these views is kind of silenced, while positions on opposite sides become entrenched. And that's what we're seeing, this increasing polarization, particularly in America, but also in Australia. And this makes it harder and harder to have meaningful dialogue between groups, which is really bad news because we need to work together to solve the problems we face on climate change. We won't solve them if climate change is seen as a niche issue for Greenies or the left. So we do need to ensure that we get a broad and diverse coalition of society talking together and listening to one another to come up with solutions. So climate change, you know, it may be a global problem, but its experience really defies universalization. It's felt in so many different ways. So it's felt as heat, as cold, as wet, as poverty, homelessness, as frustration, as anger, as fear, and as overwhelm. Some people define it as a problem which is caused by neoliberal forms of capitalism, but other people might say it's caused by colonialism. Some people would focus on the opportunity of climate change for carbon markets. Others might see it as a problem to be solved by technological innovations like carbon capture. So it's no wonder that it's being defined in so many different ways, and it has so many different and sometimes conflicting potential solutions that it has become this kind of political hot potato. So I know that many of you here are scientists, and communicating science has tended to involve highlighting the authority of the scientific process and providing facts and information about the evidence of change. And also, thirdly, highlighting the high degree of consensus among scientists about the causes and impacts of climate change. So all those things are great in some contexts, but I'm afraid I'm here to tell you that these kinds of communication don't cut it with audiences who think differently to you. So for all the reasons that Matt talked about, these audiences are likely to discount the authority of science. The reasons they disagree with you can't be resolved by giving them more information. And while consensus is just about possible in science, it's not something that I think we should try to mirror in public opinion about climate change. I think by doing so that we're labeling consensus as rational, and then by labeling those who disagree as irrational, it's an unhelpful addition to that kind of feeling of polarization. We need to increase democratic participation in climate action and not limit it to those who think the same as us. And doing this will mean that we have to recognize there are many different experiences and understandings of climate change, and there are also many different means to act on it. It's getting more and more important that we have this public debate that focuses on the kinds of futures we want and all of the different options that are available to us to get there. So how can we do that? So I want to suggest two broad directions that can help to improve climate communication with people who think differently. The first is respecting their right to think differently. And the second is coming back to what Matt was talking about, looking for values that you actually might share. So respecting people's right to think differently means understanding that people who don't care about climate change do have other active concerns which are no less valid. So don't assume that being unconcerned about climate change is a moral failing. Instead, I think it's really important to build relationships with people who have different life experiences to your own. And you can do that by asking what's important to them and actively listening to what they have to say. One thing I found is that appreciating that some people may find social change more threatening and more immediate than climate change is important. And I found that empathizing with the feeling of concern about social change can actually foster a sort of understanding of the concerns that underpin their resistance to climate action. And potentially, I think that's a way to identify issues, so ways to address their concerns. It's really important that we move beyond left and right. So while we are seeing that political ideology is aligned with how people are feeling about climate change for all the reasons we've talked about, if we start to put those things together and conflate them, we're making the problem worse. So where we can, we need to look for diversity of ideas within the left and the right. So show it's not a defining issue for those social groups. We need to work against the idea that action on climate change is an exclusively left-wing or greenie agenda. And no action on climate change is possible without public trust and involvement in democratic institutions. So responding to different priorities of diverse people can help to build a political culture around climate science and policy that recognises that different ends and different means are legitimate. I found that many of my PhD participants who were unconcerned about climate change did share some of my values. They were worried about looking after particular treasured environments, and they were often concerned about waste. So these were some of the values that we shared. Resilient communities are built with trust that cements them. And I think that one of the things that we might find if we start to try to have these conversations with people who think differently and build those trust relationships is that people who have these trusting relationships with people from other groups are more able to transfer their trust away from familiar but environmentally damaging systems and practices. So none of this is a very quick fix, and that's often the challenge with communicating about climate change. We know there's this huge urgency to act, but building public appetite for change does take time. I think it's important to take that time and to be really inclusive and to build relationships for lasting change. And, you know, if we didn't start yesterday, we might as well start now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chloe. That's, yeah, really, I found your PhD research incredibly fascinating and very useful. And as you know, that's been the foundation of quite a few of our climate change communication and engagement projects from CMS over the last few years. Okay, so we'll move on now to Dr. Gabi Mocatta. So thanks very much for joining us, Gabi. And if you could share your slides and start off by briefly introducing yourself as well. And I'm looking forward to the questions at the end. So after Gabi's talk, we'll go to a panel discussion and some Q&A. So pop your questions in the chat or feel free to ask them at the time. Thanks, Gabi.
Thanks, Greta, and thanks, Chloe and Matt, for really interesting, fascinating talks, actually. So I'm going to finish up with a brief look at communicating to drive action and inspire hope. And my background, I guess, is as a communicator, as a journalist who covered climate and environment, among other things, and I now research how this is done both through media, through building climate literacy, through translating climate science for public understanding. And I'm going to sort of draw on and perhaps add additional perspectives to what Chloe and Matt have just said. Hope. I think that image of the end of the Paris Agreement, when the Paris conference of 2015, when the Paris Agreement was reached, was a moment of hope, which maybe we haven't been able to sustain when we've seen that what's happened at COP28 and that impetus for keeping climate, a rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures or averages, as you know, is not been at the forefront of what's gone on over the last few years in terms of climate negotiations. But that image, I think, is really important when we think about hope. Now we are at a moment where we need this complete transformation, and that communication is fundamental to that. The science on climate change is detailed, it's decades long, and it's really settled. We know what the issue is and what needs to be done, although the problem is a wicked one and there are many possible ways to solve it. And despite what Matt and Chloe both had to say about people's values dictating their actions and their behaviours, more than understanding, it's still important that most people understand what the issue is and what needs to be done about it. So public understanding is really crucial, and we need everyone to understand the gravity and urgency of the situation we're in, and we need that to suffuse communities right up to policy making, so that we can drive that policy change that's needed. I argue that we need really engaging climate communication of all kinds in many locations that understands the challenges of communicating climate change and can illuminate all the pathways open to us right now for transformational change. I love this quote from David Attenborough, who jumped onto Instagram at 90-something for the first time and said this. He said, "Saving our planet is now a communications challenge." And I agree that it's really fundamental to the work that needs to be done now, most urgently, to create transformational change. So what is it that makes communicating on climate change so challenging? I'm sure you could add challenges. I've tried to summarize some of them here, and perhaps I've conflated a few. You might argue with challenge number 5 at the moment, but let's get there. So probably the first challenge is that, there's quite some complexity to both the science and the solutions. The pathways that we'll take to avoid the worst impacts of climate change are uncertain, mainly because we don't know how we'll react to the imperative to reduce emissions right now. So the human factor is what creates uncertainty in climate science and solutions to the climate issue. Climate change, of course, is a long-term threat. And when that happens, it's difficult to sustain people's engagement and their commitment to staying with that. It's also bad news when it's constantly covered in media, and it's not covered enough, and I'll argue that. People tend to turn away. There is a whole lot of research that shows that people are currently disengaging with news on climate change because it's always bad news. So that's another challenge. Challenge number 4, I think we've all felt this. Climate change tends to make us feel powerless. What can my individual efforts towards emission reduction in my own life and my own household actually do when this is such a vast global problem, and the big players and large emitters seem to be increasing rather than decreasing the issue or the problem. Challenge number 5, I've put that word invisible in inverted commas, because of course we're seeing the impacts and effects of climate change everywhere right now. But when we walk out of our offices and walk down the street, we don't see climate change in front of us every day. And so it's easy to kind of deny it or ignore it because it's not confronting us in every moment. It's in some ways invisible. Of course, challenge number 6, climate change has become highly politicized. You've spoken about that, Chloe and Matt, and we know that to be the case, which makes, dealing with it so much more complex and communicating it more complex. And it's become subject to misinformation from the realms of social media to mainstream media to interpersonal communication about climate change. Misinformation is rife and possibly increasing. So we know that most people develop their understanding of climate change from media. Once they leave formal education, if they don't gain climate change understanding there, media is where people get their understanding of climate change. And we also know that public discourses in media of all kinds, including social media, on climate change have been really problematic. To summarize decades of research, much media coverage has fallen short of presenting the causes, the scale, the impacts, the urgency, and the complexity of climate change. And also, media coverage on climate change is tiny. When we look at mainstream news media, it's about 1 to 2% of total news coverage for this biggest issue that humanity has ever faced. It's a tiny proportion of overall news. So there are some, I can dwell for a moment on media particularly, because this is where most people gain their understanding of climate change. And there are some characteristics about media themselves which have really skewed that conversation. The media's profit-orientated priorities in all sorts of ways, from media ownership to advertiser palatability of covering particular stories in particular ways. That is, dictated the trajectory of climate coverage and the amount of it as well. This thing called the issue attention cycle, which I referred to earlier, where, a big event happens, everyone's focused on that event, and then the next event happens and attention from that first event dies away. And there's this issue attention cycle between competing issues and competing events that we see in the media all the time. Ukraine war is hardly getting any coverage now because we're seeing coverage of war in Gaza. COP28 probably received less coverage than previous COPs because of the current geopolitical conflicts that we're seeing. Media have also been inadvertently and sometimes intentionally have been platforms for the reproduction of organized misinformation. And when I say organized misinformation, I mean primarily that promoted by the fossil fuel industry lobby, which has been funded to the tune of millions of dollars in many countries, particularly in the US, in order to obfuscate climate science and to muddy the waters and confuse and deny and delay action on climate change. So all these things have really affected media coverage and therefore public understanding and even policymaker understanding, and undoubtedly climate action. And of course, in Australia, especially, the tortured nature of climate politics has fed into media coverage and public understanding. And as a consequence, people in many places in Australia particularly actually do have quite low levels of climate literacy, so understanding the issues and solutions, and also efficacy, understanding what they can do to be part of the solutions. However, there are quite high levels of concern around climate change in Australia and in many countries. Polls consistently show high 70s to 80-something% of people in this country and in Australia are concerned about climate change and want to see action. And globally, the largest ever global poll around climate change has shown that 66% of people globally see climate change as an emergency. So, people everywhere are pretty concerned. So to come back to communication, decades of research gives us a detailed picture of how we can more productively communicate climate change. And I've talked about media, but in fact, we're all climate communicators here, in our work as researchers and scientists, but also just as people, as individuals, people that have conversations with friends and those who we meet, in our travels in this world. So what I'm going to present now are just a few thoughts and ideas that distill some of the, detailed decades-long research on climate communication that can be deployed both in our professional work, but also in, the climate conversations that we have with others. So these are in no particular order, and happy to expand more in the conversation afterwards. But one of the things that research tells us that works for climate communication is to tell stories about climate change in local environments that people can relate to, the places that you see every day, the places that, as Chloe said, you value and you want to see, kept as they are and not harmed. We need to focus on the now and not just the future. Climate change has often been spoken about as a future problem, and we actually always look to the future when we're trying to illustrate the problem of climate change. We need to speak about it as now, and we need to, in doing that, communicate urgency. I think there's a really important place for talking about responsibility, who's responsible and who needs to be accountable. From, the fossil fuel industry to consumers like the 1% to which most of us belong, who are consuming beyond planetary boundaries, and that lifestyles will need to change. Imagery is really important. So while disaster images, of course, have their place and often illustrate communication about climate change, locally relevant images of solutions and people, working towards solutions have been found to be more engaging in, the substantial body of research about imagery. Fear-based messaging is something that has been deployed in communicating about climate for a long time, but research actually shows that it can make people turn away or deny the problem, and therefore we need to really focus on efficacy. So that means communicating concrete actions that people can undertake and solutions when communicating climate change. There's some research that shows that fear-based messaging followed immediately by, and this is what you can do, can be effective. But fear-based messaging on its own is, actually detrimental to action. But Chloe might disagree with this, and some of you might also disagree, but there's research that shows that it's worthwhile focusing communication efforts on that really large climate majority, and not spending too much time on trying to persuade the minority of climate deniers, which I think in this country are around 12%, and similar in other places. In fact, in Australia, it's slightly higher than some other national contexts. Most people understand the world through stories and anecdotes, not statistics and graphs. So storytelling is quite an effective technique for climate communication. We can aim for a bit of a narrative structure and tell ordinary people's stories that bring down this global problem to a person scale. Matt talked briefly about misinformation. I probably can't elaborate too much given the time that we have, but there's been a lot of research that shows how we can inoculate people against misinformation by showing them a little bit of misinformation and then telling them what is in fact correct, so that next time they encounter that misinformation, they're kind of immune to it. There are all sorts of novel ways to communicate climate change. You might have seen the film 2040, an Australian-made film which coined this phrase fact-based dreaming. So dreaming with the technologies and possibilities that we have now, and projecting those into, what we could do with those if we deployed them, what the future might look like. And then AR, VR, virtual and extended reality have also been used for stimulating empathy and people's understanding of futures, both imagined and threatened, if you like. That just leads into the fact that we need to emphasize that we have all the technologies that we need right now to decarbonize and avoid the worst effects of climate change. We don't need to wait for future technological innovation, and that needs to be made clear in communicating climate. We shouldn't shy away from the fact that lifestyles really need to change. That is something that is not often addressed or sufficiently addressed in a lot of media communication about climate change. And then to cite Antonio Guterres, the UN head, we need everyone everywhere all at once on this problem. Climate change, change is needed on individual, communal, national, and global levels. And everyone can be a part of this. Everyone can use their talents, and every fraction of a degree matters. Couple more points. It's important to acknowledge and express emotion in communicating climate change. Quite a lot of research that shows that people are angry, and that anger can actually be productive in messaging about climate change. Outrage is actually a really productive emotion that I think a lot of us feel, leads to activism, can be part of climate messaging. And grief and anxiety are also real and can help galvanize change. And just to underscore what Chloe said, maybe I won't even repeat this point, but it's really important to connect with what matters to your audience, as her research has shown. And that regard for audiences' worldview should really underpin all climate change communication, which means listening to and understanding who you're communicating with in all contexts. So just to summarize, from my perspective, and I think for many of us, climate change is not a problem that needs to be communicated only with more science data. That notion is really outdated. That deficit model of science communication has been shown by research, no longer to be effective or what we need right now. Climate change is a social problem, and it really demands social understanding and social solutions. And of course, communicating is really at the heart of this. And I'd even argue that effective communication on climate may now dictate how, or indeed whether, we take the action needed in the next decade to avoid the worst extremes of climate change.
Thank you very much, Gabi. If people are after more information for the marine heatwave, there is a marine heatwave response plan on the website from NRE Tasmania. So lots of information there where you can keep track of what's happening with the heatwave. If you're interested in keeping in touch with marine science in Tasmania, there's the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies has a newsletter that goes out regularly. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre has a heatwave response plan up on their website, and some videos and more information, I believe, going up later. And CMS has a Friends of CMS email list and a CMS LinkedIn page where you can sign up for more information about events and marine research and activities that are going on here in Tasmania. I want to thank all of the people that have participated in this webinar series. We've had 5 chairs, 18 presenters. Each day we've had between 70 and 110 people online. I'd like to thank our co-host, Emily Ogier, for her instigation and organisation of the seminar series, and Dr. Hannah Fogarty as well for all of her organisation. If you're seeing any unusual species in our marine environment over the next couple of months, don't forget to log them on RedMap. There's also a Curious Climate Tasmania website with some information in particular around schools and questions that school kids have that Dr. Chloe Lucas started and Gabi's involved in, as well as myself and a number of other people. Lots of question and answers on that website about climate change. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and would just thank everybody again for participating in the webinar series. And now we can go to some Q&A until about 10 past, if that's okay. So our presenters, if you can pop your microphones on. We've got lots of questions in the chat. I've got half a dozen myself, but we'll go to the ones in the chat first.
So Zoe's question was whether there's a role that Conservatives who do feel that climate change is a big worry can play a role influencing other Conservatives. And she talked about Andrew Forrest's recent statements on the need for action. And I think that is a really fundamental, useful thing that we can do. And to start conversations with influencers on the right is a really important thing. I couldn't find a paper, but Matt's helpfully put a Nature article in there.
Yeah, that's a cool Nature climate change paper. There were some state elections in Georgia and Missouri, I think, and they used local Conservative politicians to put out in ads to pitch climate friendly messages. and it seemed to swing opinions and voting behaviour, not enormously, which, I mean, you wouldn't expect it to swing a whole election, but it seemed to make a substantial difference. So, a beautiful study, definitely worth a read.
But just on that, what I found was that a lot of people, you know, they're parroting opinions that they've heard from their social group, but they don't necessarily hold them very strongly. So those are the people on the right that are really worth trying to sort of persuade that this is not necessarily a partisan issue, and trying to get them to think more deeply about climate change. And that is one way to do it really well, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, there's a couple of really innovative approaches at the moment, isn't there? Like I saw in the UK some comedians that were getting quite sweary. So they had these really quite, you know, very, very staid researchers talking in quite a boring way. And then they had the comedian talking in the sweary, funny way to interpret the science. And that seemed really good as well. Lots of questions coming through the chat. Katie's got one about, is the relationship between science distrust against progressive or conservative thinking the same for younger people, or does that change over time? Does anyone want to answer that one?
Oh, you just published a paper on this in Global Environmental Change, didn't you?
A little bit about, well, so we did a survey of young people who, so it was an open call, so it could be anyone. We didn't look at their politics, but we asked them about their emotions about climate change and when they talk about climate change and who they talk about climate change with, and we found that young people are more likely to talk about climate change if they feel that they're being listened to by adults who are actually actively listening to them and care about that. So yeah, that's being open to listening to young people was really the key message of that, and we found that they're often feeling powerless and frustrated about climate change. I read recently, I think in The Guardian, that young people in Australia are not shifting right as they get older. And partly that may be to do with some of the ongoing challenges that they're facing that don't seem to be going away with age, around the cost of living and rental prices and things like that. I don't know that that's true elsewhere in the world, and we are seeing a lot of right-wing governments springing up. And I think, you know, the one thing that climate change does is it makes us all very afraid, and that tends to make us shore up our walls. You know, we put up our self-protection things, and often that means, you know, right-wing ways of looking at things. So I wouldn't like to say that that was a foregone conclusion that we're going in the right direction.
Thanks, Chloe. There's another question there from Ben Arthur. Given the high levels of concern re climate change by the majority of Australians, is it time we write off the minority who dismiss it as an issue? Are these groups holding opinions that are never going to change, and it's, you know, distracting our efforts? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'm happy to jump in, but I'm sure I'm going to say, I'll say something that's controversial here. There's been lots of research on this, and there's the audience segmentation research, which started out of the US, the Climate Change's 6 Americas, which has been extended to lots of other, that's out of Yale University's Climate Communication Research Center, and that's been extended to lots of other national contexts. And while there is a, what's the word, kind of a maybe impenetrable kind of climate denying or skeptical portion of populations in many countries, including in Australia, it's really quite small. It is like that 8, 10, 12% in most places. What's really important is that middle segment of population that is concerned but not maybe prepared for action. So it's kind of tipping concern into action, or concern into higher levels of concern that lead to public voting behavior and so on. That is really crucial. So my understanding, and there's some research that supports this, that middle section is a more important place to focus our climate communication than speaking with those who are already highly concerned and active, and those that maybe we're never going to be able to persuade on this issue, although they can be, of course, vociferous, right? They may be a loud minority. And just on that point, sorry, about young people and less of a tendency to move towards right, there's also some research that shows that people that lived experience of climate disasters and impacts is kind of inoculating people against climate skepticism at all levels of society, and making people more concerned. Of course, that's intuitive. We understand that. So perhaps as more people live climate impacts, you know, the less we'll have to undertake this persuasive communication around climate, because it's there front and center in people's lives. I'll let others jump in.
I think that was just a brilliant answer, Gabi. I don't think I've got anything to add to that. That was fantastic.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Em's put a question in the chat. Can we assume that younger people have experienced more exposure to climate science at formative times, and it's therefore more normalised for them?
Yes, I think young people have experienced more exposure to climate change itself, and potentially also climate science, although, you know, we still go to a lot of schools and find that there's a low level of climate literacy in schools. They're not learning about climate change in schools as part of the curriculum particularly. Yeah. So I think there's a lot more that we can do in that space. But you know, in public discourse, it is an issue that young people know about. So whether they know about the science or not, I mean, often I go and ask people, what do you know about climate change? And the first thing they bring up is the hole in the ozone layer in schools. You know, so that I wouldn't like to overstate the amount that they necessarily know, but they know it's a problem and they know it's affecting them. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, have we got any more questions from the people that have hung in online? So thanks very much for staying for a little bit longer. Is there anyone that wants to flick on their microphone and ask a question? No microphones flicking on. Okay, well, mine is about the patience of climate scientists. So I like to think that I'm a reasonable communicator and that I've got a reasonable understanding of, like I come from a background where there, you know, science wasn't a thing, not a very, you know, no one in our family went to university, so I'm used to the science denial side of things and feel like I'm reasonably tolerant of that. But just in the last couple of weeks, I've been finding it more and more difficult to not just unleash on people online. And so I'm wondering, you know, do you have any advice for scientists like me where our patience is very, very thin?
I'm not sure I've got anything beyond please keep going.
Oh. Yeah, because
I know the feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's about the marine heat wave. It doesn't exist. We're making it up. What can we do about it anyway? You know, all those sorts of things online, and it's I find it quite traumatic.
I'm sure you're already doing things like just keep in contact with your people and, you know, people who share the same understanding of the situation. Yeah, because there's the flood of misinformation and rubbish and vitriol out there is just it's unbelievable. Yeah, and it's like when something happens, there's an up, you know, that I think, oh, that's obvious. It's obvious it's climate change. It's got to be obvious now that it's a genuine, real thing. But it's like it increases the denial. You get this backlash effect when something happens.
I think that is becoming more of an organised thing, isn't it? It's actually that's you know, that small vocal minority that Gabi was talking about, trying to make a bigger noise to persuade those people who are leaning right but are not necessarily totally persuaded. So in a way, you know, you're providing in a way you're providing the platform, but you're also providing the alternative perspective on that. Yeah, that's really hard, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking of Karen's advice that we put on Curious Climate Schools around how to deal with the, you know, that when you're feeling really low about climate change and you feel that there's nothing you can do and you're frustrated, you know, to look for the things that do lift you up, that the people who kind of give you energy, and to come back to the things you can control more, to kind of center yourself, and when you've got more energy, to move out to the things that you can influence.
Yeah, so that's referring to some resources on the Curious Climate Schools website, written by Karen Grant, who's a counsellor around eco distress and climate distress and things, and that's up on the Curious Climate Schools website. Sorry, Matt, you were saying?
I was actually, for what it's worth, there's a story I really like from a researcher, a psychology researcher in America, actually completely different field, in eyewitness memory, and he started that back in the late 70s. And the upshot of all of this is you just got to hope that at some point people will start taking you seriously and listening. So he'd been working on this stuff on eyewitness memory for 15, 20 years. All of a sudden in the early 90s, there was a boom in DNA testing, and the news was filled with stories of people who'd been in prison 15, 20 years for murders they just did not commit. And all over the media, people saying, we need to fix this. How on earth could this happen? And all of a sudden, the US Attorney General calls him up to speak to hundreds of politicians and police officers and so on. And he's got 15, 20 years of good, solid science. So he's able to say, we know that this is a problem. This is what we can do. We know that this is a problem. This is what we can do. Doesn't always pan out like that. But for those 15, 20 years, he didn't know he was ever going to be in a room with important people who were actually going to take him seriously. So I don't know what else needs to happen for people to take climate change stuff seriously, but you've got to hope that it's going to happen. You've got to hope at some point an influential person will be willing to listen to your advice. Yeah.
Speaking of hope, let's finish up with, I'm going to ask you all a question, and that is, what advice would you give to, you know, people in our research community that are trying to communicate with you know, diverse audiences around climate change? What would be your number one bit of advice? And we'll start with Gabi. First on my screen. Sorry.
One thing I didn't say, and I think really is worthwhile including in the messages that we put out, is that life can be better for many globally if we deal with climate in an appropriate way as soon as possible. We can improve life for many people everywhere. I think that's huge.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thanks, Gabi. Chloe?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. We need to be having conversations about a future in which we can thrive, and maybe asking people what that means to them, and listening to the kinds of answers they're giving might take us there. So not necessarily focusing on the problem of climate change, but first on what kind of future we want together.
Yeah, creating that mobilizing vision that looks much more appealing, that we'd all like to move towards, rather than moving away from the scary thing. Thanks, Chloe. And Matt, lucky last.
Yep, same idea. There's a lot of things to do with climate change and what we can do to try and mitigate it that will appeal to everyone. You know, so not just better quality of life for people, but better health outcomes, new business opportunities, energy security, food security. These are things that should appeal to a very, very wide range of folks.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much to all the people that have stayed for 15 minutes longer to listen and contribute to what we can do about communicating climate change for motivating action. And thank you to Dr. Emily Ogier online for instigating this seminar series around the heatwave. Dr. Hannah Fogarty for her organisation of the event, and all of our wonderful presenters and chairs and people contributing, watching, listening and popping questions in the chat. I've found it a really inspiring week, so I hope you have too. We'll be putting all of this up on the website. Hannah's been incredibly efficient, and everything's most things are up there already bar this recording. Please contact us if there's any other information that we can pop up on that page too that might be of interest. And I hope you try and connect with the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Science via our newsletter and Facebook page, and the Centre for Marine Social Ecology via our Friends of CMS email list as well, to find out about more events coming up. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll stop the recording there. And we are contemplating running another series later on in March around what might have happened over the heatwave. So we'll keep you informed about that as well. Thanks very much, everyone.